The helmsman repeated the order. Then he repeated it again. At 9:44 p.m. on January 13, 2012, the words coming through the bridge of the Costa Concordia were clear, but the ship was no longer listening. 23 seconds later, a sound moved through the lower decks. Not an explosion, but something slower, deeper. The groan of steel finding granite, the beginning of the end. If investigations like this one hold your attention, the engineering failures, the human decisions that precede catastrophe, the seconds that rewrite everything, consider subscribing to this channel. We are working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and your presence here makes this work possible. The Costa Concordia was not a small vessel. At 290 meters in length and 500 gross tons, she was among the largest passenger ships ever built in Italy, longer than 3 football fields, taller than a 15-story building. A floating city carrying 229 people through the calm winter waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea on a 7-day Mediterranean cruise. Her 17 decks held restaurants, theaters, a casino, a wellness center with marble floors. That evening, many of her 206 passengers were seated for dinner. The wine was being poured. The lights of the Tuscan coast drifted past the windows. Everything was ordinary. In the hours that followed, 32 people would die. The ship would come to rest on her starboard side in 17 meters of water, half submerged against the rocky shore of the Isola del Giglio, a vessel worth €500 million reduced to wreckage visible from space. It would become the largest passenger ship ever wrecked and the most expensive maritime salvage operation in history. The images would circle the world. A cruise liner lying like a beached whale against an island barely 3 miles long, her hull torn open, her decks tilted into the sea. The official narrative would coalesce quickly. A reckless captain, an unauthorized maneuver, a delayed evacuation. The man at the center of the disaster, Captain Francesco Schettino, would become one of the most vilified figures in modern maritime history, condemned in the press long before any court delivered a verdict. The phrase that would follow him, the captain who abandoned his ship, captured something that felt complete, a story with a clear villain and a clear moral. It was a story that satisfied. But disasters of this magnitude are rarely so simple. The rocks that tore through the Concordia's hull that night did not materialize without warning. The decisions that placed her there did not emerge from a vacuum. Behind the spectacle of a capsized liner and a fleeing captain lay a longer sequence, years of corporate culture, maritime tradition, regulatory assumption, and the particular dynamics of a ship's bridge, where one man's authority was absolute and unchallenged. The Costa Concordia was executing a maneuver known as an incino, a salute, a bow. The ship would pass unusually close to the island, allowing passengers to admire the lights of Giglio Porto and the residents of the island to admire the illuminated ship. It was not in the approved voyage plan. It had not been sanctioned by the company in any official document. Yet it had happened before, on this route and others, a tradition that existed in the space between written rules and accepted practice. At 9:42 p.m., the ship was traveling at 15 knots. The rocks of Le Scole, a reef extending from the island's southern point, lay directly ahead. On the bridge, the captain had taken direct control of navigation. The officers around him watched the displays, watched the shoreline growing closer, watched the depth readings change. The question that would haunt the investigation was not only why the captain gave the orders he gave, but why no one countermanded them. Why the hierarchy of the bridge held firm, even as the margins for error collapsed to nothing. When a single person holds ultimate authority, who has the power to say no? The helmsman turned the wheel as ordered, 4 degrees to port, then hard to starboard. The great ship began to pivot, but her momentum carried her forward. The reef did not move. At 9:45:07 p.m., the first contact was recorded, A lateral impact along 70 meters of the port side, opening a gash below the waterline that would flood 5 compartments in minutes. The lights flickered, the engines stopped, the ship began to list, and in the dining rooms and lounges and corridors of the Costa Concordia, 4,000 people felt the world shift beneath them without yet understanding why. What happened in the next hour would determine who lived and who died. But to understand that hour, one must first understand what came before, the ship that was built, the systems that were trusted, and the culture that made it possible for a vessel of this size to sail so close to the edge. To understand what failed, one must first understand what was built. The Costa Concordia was born from ambition, the ambition of an industry racing to build larger, more luxurious vessels than any that had come before. By the early 2000s, the cruise market had transformed from a niche luxury into mass tourism. Ships that once carried hundreds now carried thousands. The economics were clear. Bigger ships meant lower costs per passenger, more onboard revenue, more profit. The question was no longer whether to build floating cities, but how large those cities could become. Costa Crociere, the Italian subsidiary of the Carnival Corporation, commissioned the Concordia in 2004. She would be the flagship of a new Concordia class, 5 sister ships designed to dominate the Mediterranean market. The contract went to Fincantieri, Italy's largest shipbuilder, whose yards at Sestri Ponente near Genoa had constructed vessels for navies and cruise lines for over 2 centuries. The keel was laid in September 2004. The ship that took shape over the following 2 years represented the pinnacle of Italian maritime engineering, a source of national pride in a country where shipbuilding was woven into cultural identity. The specifications were staggering: 17 passenger decks, 4 swimming pools, a grand atrium spanning 3 decks, crowned by a replica of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. She could accommodate 3 780 passengers, served by a crew of over 1,000. Her 4 main engines drove her through the water at nearly 23 knots. But beneath the marble and the chandeliers, the Costa Concordia was also a machine, governed by the fundamental laws of naval architecture: stability, buoyancy, the calculus of watertight integrity. These were the invisible constraints that shaped every decision, the physics that luxury could not override. The ship was designed to survive flooding. Like all modern passenger vessels, she was divided into watertight compartments, separated by steel bulkheads. The principle dated back to the 19th century. If the hull was breached, the flooding could be contained. The Concordia's designers calculated that she could remain afloat with any 2 adjacent compartments flooded. This was the standard, 2-compartment survivability, mandated by the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, the global regulatory framework born from the Titanic disaster a century earlier. 2 compartments. The number reflected a calculation of acceptable risk, a statistical judgment about the kinds of damage a ship might reasonably encounter: a collision with another vessel, a grounding on a sandbar, an impact that might open a gash of 10 or 15 meters. The regulations assumed that catastrophic damage, the kind that might breach 3 or 4 or 5 compartments simultaneously, was too unlikely to design against. What the regulations did not fully account for was the changing nature of the ships themselves. The Concordia was not the Titanic. She was wider, taller, with a higher center of gravity, and more windage. Her passenger spaces rose like a wedding cake above the waterline. In calm conditions, this posed no problem. But if the ship began to list, if flooding shifted her weight to one side, those towering decks would act as a lever, accelerating the roll. The mathematics of stability could turn against her with terrifying speed. The engineers at Fincantieri understood these dynamics. The Costa Concordia passed every required stability test. On paper, she was safe. She met every regulation. She exceeded many. The safety systems were state-of-the-art: fire suppression, evacuation protocols, lifeboat capacity for all passengers and crew. A certification, however, measures compliance with existing rules. It does not measure what the rules fail to anticipate. The Costa Concordia was delivered to Costa Crociere in June 2006. She departed on her maiden voyage on July 14th, sailing from Civitavecchia to Barcelona with a full complement of passengers. Over the following 5.5 years, she would complete hundreds of cruises, carrying tens of thousands of passengers across the Mediterranean without serious incident. In that time, she also developed routines that existed outside the official procedures: shortcuts, traditions, the accumulated habits of a crew who knew their ship and believed they understood its limits. Among these was the practice of the incino, the salute, the close pass by a coastline or an island to thrill passengers and honor the residents ashore. It was not written in any manual. It was not approved in any voyage plan. But it happened, again and again, on the Concordia and her sister ships, a spectacle that passengers loved and that the company tolerated in silence. The ship had been built to survive certain kinds of damage. No one had calculated what would happen if she struck a reef at 15 knots, 70 meters of her hull torn open in a single blow. No regulation required that she survive such an impact. No designer had planned for it. The gap between what was built and what was assumed would prove fatal. The ship was a marvel of engineering, but a ship does not sail itself. At the center of every voyage stood a single figure whose authority, by law and tradition, was absolute: the captain. Francesco Schettino came to command through the conventional path. Born in 1960 in Meta di Sorrento, a town on the Amalfi coast, where the sea was a way of life, he earned his captain's license in 2002 after years on cargo vessels and ferries. By 2010, he commanded the Costa Concordia. His record was clean: no accidents, no sanctions. He had completed the required certifications, passed the examinations, accumulated the sea time. Within the company, he was known as a capable officer who understood the commercial realities of the cruise industry, the importance of passenger satisfaction, of spectacle, of giving guests an experience worth remembering. What the credentials did not capture was harder to measure: leadership under pressure, judgment in crisis, the willingness to acknowledge error. These qualities reveal themselves only when tested, and the cruise industry rarely tested them. The routes were familiar, the weather predictable. A captain could serve for decades without facing a genuine emergency, never learning whether he possessed the rarer gift of command when everything went wrong. The bridge of a modern cruise ship is a study in technological confidence. Radar systems paint the surrounding waters in precise detail. Electronic chart displays show the vessel's position to within meters. Autopilot systems maintain course and speed with minimal human intervention. The officer of the watch monitors instruments verifies readings, maintains situational awareness. The captain oversees, decides, commands. But the technology that makes navigation safer also changes the nature of the work. Officers trained on electronic systems may never develop the instinctive feel for wind and current that earlier generations acquired through necessity. The automation that prevents small errors can mask the degradation of fundamental skills. And the reliability breeds a subtle complacency, a faith that the instruments will always be correct, that the machine will catch what the human misses. On the Costa Concordia, as on most modern vessels, the bridge operated within a strict hierarchy. The captain's word was final. Junior officers might observe, might question privately, might note concerns in logs no one would read until after disaster struck. But to openly challenge a captain's decision required a courage that the culture did not encourage. Maritime tradition venerated the master's authority. Corporate culture reinforced it. The psychological distance between a junior officer and the man who controlled his career was vast. This was not unique to Costa Crociere. The phenomenon had a name in the safety literature: authority gradient. When the gap in perceived authority between team members is too steep, critical information fails to flow upward. Warnings go unspoken. Doubts remain private. The person with the least experience, but the clearest view of a developing problem, stays silent, unwilling to contradict the person with the most authority, but the narrowest focus. Aviation had confronted this problem decades earlier, after crashes in which capable crews flew functioning aircraft into the ground, because junior officers failed to challenge captains making obvious errors. The response was crew resource management, structured protocols to flatten the authority gradient, to make challenge not just permitted, but expected. The maritime industry adopted similar principles on paper. Bridge resource management became part of officer training, but implementation varied wildly. On some ships, the protocols were rigorous. On others, they existed only in training manuals, artifacts of a checkbox culture that valued documentation over practice. Costa Crociere trained its officers in bridge resource management. The company's procedures emphasized teamwork and communication. But procedures on paper and culture on the bridge are different things. The question was not whether officers knew they could challenge the captain. The question was whether, in the moment, with the shoreline approaching and the captain's hands on the controls, anyone would actually do it. The warning signs were there. They were not hidden. They were normalized. The close passes by coastlines had become routine. The Incino was not a secret. Passengers photographed it, posted videos online, celebrated the thrill. The company received these images and did not intervene. The practice continued because it was never punished, never formally prohibited, never acknowledged as the risk it was. Somewhere between the written procedures and the lived reality, a gap had opened. The ship was designed to operate within certain parameters. The regulations assumed those parameters would be respected. The culture had drifted. No one had decided to make the Costa Concordia unsafe. The danger accumulated through 1,000 small accommodations, each one reasonable in isolation, invisible in aggregate. The clock was running. No one had agreed on when it started. January 13, 2012, began like any other Friday in the cruise industry. The Costa Concordia lay berthed at Civitavecchia, the port of Rome, taking on passengers for a 7-day Mediterranean itinerary. The weather was fair. The sea was calm. By early afternoon 206 passengers had boarded, families, couples, retirees from across Europe. A retired couple celebrating 50 years of marriage. Children too young to remember anything that would follow. The crew numbered 023 from dozens of countries: Indonesia, the Philippines, India, Italy, Honduras. Some had served on the Concordia for years. Others were new, still learning the layout of a ship large enough to get lost in. At 7:18 p.m., the Costa Concordia departed Civitavecchia, bound for Savona, with scheduled stops at ports across the western Mediterranean. The voyage plan filed with the company showed a standard route, one the ship had sailed hundreds of times before. The course would take her northwest, passing well clear of the islands that dotted the Tuscan coast. But the voyage plan was not the whole story. Captain Schettino had informed his officers of his intention to perform a salute as the ship passed the Isola del Giglio. The island lay roughly 2 hours from Civitavecchia, a small rocky outcrop with a population of fewer than 1,000 permanent residents. One of those residents was Mario Palombo, a retired Costa captain who had mentored Schettino years earlier. The pass would honor him. It would also delight the passengers, who would see the lights of Giglio Porto from their balconies as the great ship glided past. The maneuver was not in the official voyage plan. It had not been formally approved by the company's operations center. but it was not unprecedented. Schettino had performed similar salutes before, past Giglio, past other islands, past coastal towns, where the sight of an illuminated cruise ship passing close to shore was a minor spectacle. Other Costa captains had done the same. The practice existed in a grey zone, neither explicitly authorized nor explicitly forbidden, tolerated as long as nothing went wrong. On the bridge that evening, the atmosphere was routine. The first officer, Kiro Ambrosio, was present. So was the helmsman, Jacob Rusli Bin, an Indonesian seaman who had served on the Concordia for years. The ship's Indonesian translator was also on the bridge, not a navigation officer, but a guest of the captain who had asked to watch the salute. Her presence would later become a point of controversy, a symbol of the casual atmosphere that prevailed in the minutes before disaster. At 9:30 p.m., the Costa Concordia was approximately 3 nautical miles south of Giglio, traveling at 15.5 knots. The lights of the island were visible to starboard. The captain took direct control of the navigation, a practice permitted under maritime law, but unusual for routine passages. He ordered a course change to bring the ship closer to the island. The electronic chart system displayed the ship's position in real time. It also displayed the hazards, the shallow waters, the rocks, the reef extending south from Punta Gabbianara, known as Lescol. These dangers were marked. They were visible. They required no special expertise to interpret. What the chart could not display was the narrowing margin between the ship's course and catastrophe. At 15 knots, the Concordia covered roughly 450 meters every minute. Her turning radius at that speed was measured in hundreds of meters. She was not a speedboat. She was a 114, 500-ton vessel with momentum that took time and distance to arrest or redirect. The officers on the bridge watched the shoreline grow closer. The depth readings decreased. The standard practice in such situations was clear. If any officer had concerns about the safety of a maneuver, they were trained to voice them. The company's bridge resource management protocols specified escalating levels of intervention, suggestion, then direct recommendation, then explicit challenge. No one challenged the captain. Later, investigators would ask why. The answers were fragmentary: deference to authority, assumption that the captain knew something they did not, the belief that he had done this before without incident, the social difficulty of contradicting a superior in front of others, the seconds that passed while each officer waited for someone else to speak first. At 9:42 p.m., the ship was less than half a nautical mile from the rocks. The captain ordered a turn to port, away from the island toward open water. The helmsman acknowledged and executed. But the turn was too shallow, too late. The ship's bow began to swing, but her stern continued on the original trajectory, carried by momentum toward the reef that now lay directly in her path. The next 60 seconds would unfold in a sequence of orders, responses, and realizations. Starboard 20. Hard to starboard. The growing awareness that something was wrong. The sound that no one on the bridge could yet identify, but that everyone, in some part of their mind, already understood. What happened next would be measured in seconds. At 9:45:07 p.m., the Costa Concordia struck the reef known as Lescol. The impact was not a single blow, but a sustained grinding. 70 meters of hull dragged across granite at 15 knots. The rock penetrated the outer shell, the inner hull, then the watertight compartments designed to contain exactly this kind of damage. The design had assumed a breach of 2 compartments. The reef opened 5. In the engine rooms, the sea entered with a violence that no drill had simulated. Generators failed. Lights flickered and died across entire decks. The ship's propulsion ceased. Emergency lighting activated, casting the corridors in the dim glow that passengers would later describe as the first sign that something was deeply wrong. On the bridge, the initial seconds were consumed by confusion. The helmsman reported that the rudder was not responding. The instruments showed cascading failures. The captain, moments earlier in full command, now faced a situation that exceeded any scenario he had trained for. The ship was wounded in ways that the bridge systems could not immediately quantify. Below, in the passenger areas, the experience was different. A shudder, a sound like thunder, plates sliding off tables, glasses shattering. Then an unfamiliar sensation, the floor beginning to tilt, slowly at first, then with gathering conviction. Passengers looked at one another, waiting for an announcement, some official voice to tell them what was happening. The announcement did not come. At 9:51 p.m., 6 minutes after impact, the captain made the first public statement. It was not an emergency alert. It was a reassurance. The ship had experienced an electrical failure, passengers were told. The situation was under control. They should remain calm and await further instructions. The lie was deliberate. Schettino would later testify that he withheld the truth to prevent panic. But the deception had consequences that cascaded through the following hour. Passengers who might have moved toward muster stations instead returned to their cabins. Crew members who awaited orders continued to await them. The precious minutes when an organized evacuation might have proceeded smoothly were consumed by a fiction. The ship was listing now, tilting to starboard as the flooded compartments dragged her down on one side. The list was measurable: 5 degrees by 9, 50, 10 degrees by 10, hydro 0. Physics was asserting itself. The towering superstructure that made the Concordia so impressive in port was now a liability, a sail catching no wind but amplifying every degree of roll. At 10:06 p.m., the Italian Coast Guard received its first communication about the incident, not from the ship, but from a passenger's relative on shore who had received a phone call describing the chaos aboard. The Coast Guard contacted the Concordia. The captain reported a blackout. When pressed about the emergency, his responses were evasive. The protocols for maritime emergencies are unambiguous. When a vessel is in distress, the captain must notify authorities, assess the situation, and, if necessary, order abandonment. The decision to abandon ship, to launch lifeboats and evacuate passengers, is the captain's alone. It cannot be delegated. It cannot be deferred to shore authorities. The master commands. But Schettino did not give the order. The minutes passed. The list increased. Passengers began to understand, without being told, that the reassurances were false. Some made their way to the muster stations on their own initiative. Others waited in their cabins, trusting the crew, trusting the system, trusting that someone in authority would tell them what to do. The crew faced their own crisis of information. Many had not been informed of the true situation. Department heads awaited guidance from the bridge. Junior officers awaited guidance from department heads. The hierarchy that maintained order in normal operations now impeded the rapid response that emergency demanded. At 10:33 p.m., the Coast Guard captain in Livorno, Gregorio De Falco, made direct contact with the Concordia. The list had reached 20 degrees. Passengers were beginning to fall. Lifeboats on the high side of the ship could no longer be launched. De Falco demanded a situation report. The responses he received did not match the distress calls now flooding in from passengers' cell phones. Somewhere on that tilting deck, in the darkness broken only by emergency lights and the glow of smartphones, 4,000 people waited for someone to tell them what came next. The lifeboats hung at angles that made boarding treacherous. The evacuation slides had not been deployed. The order to abandon ship, the words that would release passengers and crew from their stations and send them toward the boats, remained unspoken. When a single person holds ultimate authority, the system depends entirely on that person's judgment, and judgment under pressure can fail. The clock showed 10:48 p.m. More than an hour had passed since impact. The order had still not been given. At 10:54 p.m., Captain Schettino finally gave the order to abandon ship. 1 hour and 9 minutes had passed since the impact. In that time, the list had increased to nearly 30 degrees. Passengers had begun evacuating on their own initiative, crowding the muster stations, climbing into lifeboats that crew members struggled to launch from a deck that was no longer horizontal. The physics of evacuation on a listing ship are unforgiving. Lifeboats are designed to be lowered from davits that swing outward over the water. When the ship is level, the process is straightforward. When the ship is tilted 30 degrees to starboard, the lifeboats on the port side hang inward, unreachable. The lifeboats on the starboard side hang outward, but passengers must climb uphill to reach them, then step across a widening gap between the tilting deck and the swinging boat. Many did not make it to the lifeboats at all. The evacuation slides, inflatable ramps designed for rapid descent to the water, were deployed late and on only one side of the ship. Passengers jumped, passengers fell, passengers clung to railings as the deck beneath them became a slope too steep to stand on. The crew performed with a courage that the official narrative often overlooked. Stewards who had trained for emergencies they never expected to face guided passengers through darkened corridors. Engineers remained below, fighting to maintain power, to keep the emergency lights burning, to delay the ship's final roll. Officers coordinated the launching of lifeboats under conditions that made every procedure an improvisation. But the crew could not compensate for the hour that had been lost. They could not undo the captain's decision to minimize, to delay, to hope that the situation might somehow resolve itself. The evacuation that should have been orderly became desperate. The passengers who should have been briefed and positioned were scattered, confused, many still in their cabins when the list made movement nearly impossible. At 11:19 p.m., the Costa Concordia's list reached a critical threshold. The ship rolled heavily to starboard and grounded on a rocky outcrop near the shore of Giglio. The impact halted her drift, but also sealed her fate. She would not sink into deep water. She would come to rest on her side, half submerged, against an island she had come to salute. The grounding created a temporary reprieve. Passengers who had been sliding toward the starboard rail now found the ship stabilized, if only at a terrifying angle. The proximity to shore meant that rescue boats could approach, that swimmers could reach land, that the evacuation could continue even as the lifeboats ran out. But for those trapped inside, the grounding changed nothing. The ship's interior had become a maze of vertical corridors and flooded compartments. Passengers who had retreated to their cabins found doors jammed, stairwells impassable. The geometry of the familiar transformed into something lethal. In the darkness, in the cold January water now filling the lower decks, 32 people would die. The rescue operation that unfolded over the following hours involved Coast Guard vessels, local fishing boats, helicopters, and volunteers from Giglio itself. The island's 800 residents absorbed thousands of survivors into their homes, their hotels, their church. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed the island's resources, but not its humanity. On the bridge of the Coast Guard patrol vessel, Captain Gregorio De Falco maintained contact with the Concordia throughout the night. The recordings of those conversations would later become public, played on television stations around the world. In them, De Falco demanded that Schettino return to his ship, a ship the captain had already left, boarding a lifeboat while passengers remained aboard. The phrase that would define the disaster emerged from those recordings. "Vada a bordo, cazzo." Go back on board, damn it. De Falco's voice, hoarse with frustration, commanding a captain to do what maritime tradition required, to be the last to leave a sinking ship, or to go down with it. Schettino did not return. He would later claim that he had fallen into a lifeboat by accident, that the ship's list made it impossible to reboard, that he was coordinating the rescue from shore. The explanations satisfied no one. The image of a captain abandoning his passengers became the defining symbol of the Costa Concordia disaster, a single figure embodying a failure that was in truth far more complex. By dawn on January 14th, the evacuation was complete. The ship lay on her side, her port flank rising from the water like the hull of some beached leviathan. The first photographs showed what would become an iconic image of maritime failure, a cruise liner designed for pleasure, tilted against a rocky shore, surrounded by rescue boats and debris. The investigation had already begun, but the full accounting of decisions made and unmade, of systems trusted and betrayed, of lives lost in the space between one man's authority and everyone else's silence, would take years to complete. The investigation assigned responsibility with unusual clarity. Francesco Schettino was convicted of multiple manslaughter, causing a shipwreck and abandoning ship. In 2017, Italy's highest court upheld his sentence of 16 years. The verdict held him accountable not only for the reckless navigation, but for the delayed evacuation that cost lives. 5 other officers received lesser sentences. Costa reached a plea agreement, paying fines and compensation. The company was not required to admit wrongdoing regarding the culture that allowed the salute maneuvers to become routine. The regulatory response was substantial. The International Maritime Organization revised its guidelines on passenger ship safety, mandating improved bridge procedures and evacuation drills. The cruise industry implemented new requirements for voyage planning and captain oversight. The practice of the inchino was explicitly prohibited. The wreck itself became an engineering challenge of unprecedented scale. The Costa Concordia lay against Giglio for over 2 years, while salvage teams designed a system to right her without causing an environmental catastrophe. In September 2013, the ship was rotated upright. In July 2014, she was towed to Genoa and broken apart for scrap. The operation cost over €1.5 billion. 32 people died in the disaster. Their names are inscribed on a memorial erected on Giglio, facing the sea where the ship came to rest. The Costa Concordia disaster revealed something that engineering cannot solve: the fragility of systems that depend on human judgment exercised under pressure. The ship was built to survive damage. The procedures were designed to manage emergencies. But when the moment came, a single man's decisions, to approach too close, to delay too long, to leave too soon, overrode every safeguard. When a single person holds ultimate authority, who has the power to say no? The officers on the bridge that night had the knowledge. They had the instruments showing exactly how narrow the margin had become. What they did not have was the willingness to challenge a captain who had not yet made a mistake, until he made one that could not be undone. The question echoes beyond maritime law. It asks something fundamental about hierarchy, about the silences that accumulate where rank determines truth. The Costa Concordia was lost not because no one saw the danger, but because those who saw it did not speak, and the one who could have listened chose not to hear. The sea off Giglio is quiet now. The rocks of Lescol remain where they have always been, unmarked, indifferent. If you visit the island today, you will find a community that remembers the night 4,000 strangers arrived in darkness, and the 32 who never left. Thank you for watching. If this investigation resonated with you, consider liking and subscribing. It helps us continue this work. In the comments, tell us which disaster you would like us to examine next. Every story has a question at its center. We will keep asking them as long as you keep listening.